So continuing our conversation in our Apes Flipped classroom, today we're talking about the phosphorus cycle. So the phosphorus cycle is one of the 4 biogeochemical cycles that we need to learn for our test in May. So we're going to continue on with the phosphorus cycle. So the phosphorus cycle, we've already learned the carbon cycle, which is the movement of carbon between sources and sinks, the nitrogen cycle, which is the movement of nitrogen between sources and sinks. So this is the phosphorus cycle. And again, it's just the movement of phosphorus atoms and molecules containing phosphorus between sources and sinks. So our major reservoirs in phosphorus are significantly different from carbon and nitrogen because our major sources in the phosphorus cycle are rocks and sediment. This means that the phosphorus cycle is incredibly slow. The carbon cycle works relatively quickly and can be accelerated with things like combustion. The nitrogen cycle is even quicker than the carbon cycle, but the phosphorus cycle, because it requires the weathering of rocks, is very, very slow. It takes a long time for those phosphorus containing minerals to be weathered out of rocks and carried into soil or into bodies of water. Unlike the carbon, nitrogen, and water cycles, there is no gas phase in the phosphorus cycle. So there is no phosphorus in our atmosphere. And because phosphorus cycles so slowly, it's a limiting nutrient, meaning that in an undisturbed ecosystem, the limiting factor most of the time is phosphorus availability. Even in our current environment where there's no such thing as an undisturbed ecosystem, it is generally speaking the limiting nutrient. Our ability to create synthetic fertilizers has certainly increased the availability of phosphorus for domesticated plants. So when we talk about the phosphorus cycle, so we have the weathering of rocks releases phosphorus. That weathering comes through rain and wind that then can either be taken in the soil where it is consumed by plants through decomposition, put back into the soil, and then can be uptaken again. Or after the weathering, it can run off. We can have this same cycle within the water. So we can have uptake by plants and then animals. Eventually, we have sedimentation. Phosphorus is not very soluble in water, and so it tends to form sediment and sink to the bottom. Over millennia, that creates sedimentary rocks, which eventually can be pushed up through geologic uplift. So a few facts about phosphorus that are important for us to know about this phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus, as we said, is crucial to life. So like nitrogen, it is a component of DNA and RNA. So in terms of communicating genetic information to the next generation, but also within the cells. But it's also a critical component of ATP, which you may remember is the actual energy source that's used in the Krebs cycle. It is the actual energy source used by our cells and all living cells. It's also important in proteins and enzymes. It's also part of tooth enamel and bones. So important to all facets of life. It is mostly insoluble in water, except in the form of phosphate, and even phosphates are very limited solubility. It is a great example of how a mineral element can become part of an organism. So what are our sources of phosphorus? So our major natural source of phosphorus is the weathering of rocks that contain phosphorus-containing minerals. And again, that weathering is through wind and rain. They break down the rock and the phosphate is released and dissolves into water. That rainwater carries phosphate into the nearby soils and bodies of water. Again, it's so slow that phosphorus is often our limiting nutrient in both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. But there are also synthetic sources of phosphorus. These are human sources. So we mine phosphate minerals. And so that mining process does release some into the environment. And also we add phosphate containing minerals to products like synthetic fertilizers and detergents and cleaners. There's much less phosphate in modern detergents and cleaning products than there used to be because it is such a significant contributor to eutrophication, or the overgrowth of algae in bodies of water. So here's our natural cycle, and here's our human cycle. Those fertilizers, when we add them to lawns or agricultural fields, the runoff is going to carry the phosphorus or the phosphates into nearby bodies of water, or detergents and cleaners enter bodies of water through our wastewater from our homes. The wastewater treatment system is not really designed to remove phosphates, or didn't used to be designed to remove phosphates from the water. The modern wastewater treatment systems are much better at removing phosphates from that wastewater. Okay, so two major pieces of the phosphorus cycle: assimilation and excretion and decomposition. Just like nitrogen, phosphorus gets absorbed by plant roots and assimilates into tissues. Our animals are going to assimilate phosphorus by eating plants or other animals. When we talk about excretion or decomposition, that's when waste or dead plant matter or other biomass gets broken down by bacteria and soil decomposers, and those return the phosphate to the soil. So again, a very slow process. This forms that little mini loop within the phosphorus cycle, just like assimilation and ammonification in the nitrogen cycle, or photosynthesis and respiration in the carbon cycle. This is that mini loop. It's relatively quick, although we know the decomposition is not a fast process. And then we have sedimentation and geological uplift. As I said earlier, phosphate doesn't dissolve very well in water. Much of it forms solid bits of phosphate, or phosphate compounds, ionic compounds, that fall to the bottom of bodies of water as sediment. Over time, that sediment becomes compacted and compressed into sedimentary rock by the pressure of that overlying water. Eventually, once that rock forms, then we have geological uplift. This is when our tectonic plates collide and they force up those rock layers that form mountains. And our phosphorus cycle can start over again with the weathering and release of phosphate from rocks. So we are talking on a scale of millions of years here in order to talk about tectonic plate collision, formation of mountains, and then weathering of those mountains. Okay, so a key component of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, not of the cycles themselves, but a key byproduct of that, is this thing we call eutrophication. So when there's too much nitrogen, too much phosphorus in a body of water, then we have too much algal growth. And so you can see that in this image here. You can actually see the mat of algae on the surface of the water. This can happen through more natural processes, but very often it's what we call cultural eutrophication, which means that it's caused by humans, usually by fertilizer runoff, but also runoff from animal operations. So chicken farms and hog farms and cow farms, if that waste is not managed properly, it can run off into bodies of water and result in excess levels of nutrients in the water. That algae bloom is going to cover the surface of the water. That blocks out sunlight and kills plants that live below the surface. Once the algae use up that excess nutrients, they're eventually going to die off. Those bacteria are then going to break down that dead algae. And that process of decomposition is an aerobic process, and it's going to use up the oxygen in the water. Once that oxygen level in the water is used up, That's going to kill our aquatic animals, especially fish, things that depend on there being certain levels of dissolved oxygen in the water in order for them to extract oxygen from the water using their gills. Now we have dead animals, we have even more decomposition, we're going to use up even more oxygen. And we get this positive feedback loop. Less oxygen means more dead organisms, which means more bacterial decomposition, which means less oxygen. And this is how we create what we call dead zones. And dead zones are areas of a body of water where there is little or no life because of the eutrophication. So here's an example. We have this algal layer and it's going to block out the sunlight. Oxygen in the water is going to be depleted. Decomposition is going to further deplete the oxygen, and oxygen levels reach a point where no life is possible. And that's it for our conversations about the phosphorus cycle. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and I look forward to seeing you soon.